Hey guys, behind me you see the skyline of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. There was another earthquake during the night and the morning, and it was very strange, guys. I felt it. I'll report about this, but there were other strange things, and it was strongly felt, not only here in Vancouver, and it was quite close. And what I want to talk to you about is everyone thinks, oh yeah, the big one, the Cascadia earthquake, the 9 something magnitude, if that come, it will devastate the Pacific Northwest. And that is true. But Vancouver is due for another major earthquake that could really do so much damage, and it could really be bad. And what I uncovered today when I was researching about this earthquake, because some things were strange compared to what I felt and when I felt it compared to what the official numbers are, and I'll tell you about this later. But when I was looking up the vulnerability of Vancouver, I couldn't believe what I read, because basically they're saying Vancouver is not really quite ready, and we need to have a big earthquake first so that some buildings are collapsing. Then we can better assess how much more damage a big one could do. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. So you want to have a big one so that all these towers or everything collapses, and then you know how vulnerable it is? It's kind of crazy, guys. So stay with me. So local time, they're saying at 5 o'clock a.m., a little bit after 5:02 a.m. A magnitude, in some agencies have it different. First they said 4.8, USGS had it at 4.6. Now they have downgraded it to 4.1, but it was 10 miles east of Olga on Orcas Island. That's an island in Washington, off the coast of Washington, close to Vancouver Island, British Columbia, close to Vancouver. So it's in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And Orcas is part of the San Juan Islands. That's a region that is always riddled with earthquakes because it's riddled with small fault lines, and it has a very unique geology. The whole area has a very unique geology. And also in Canada, around Vancouver Island, we have a lot of fault lines. So it's near the Cascadia subduction zone. That might be your first question. The Cascadia subduction zone, that's the one that could create the big one, and it's overdue. But this quake likely did not occur on this major tectonic boundary. It was on one of the more shallow local faults. And the thing was, guys, so I have to tell you, I felt it. I just laid down in my bed. It was really weird. I was sitting on the bed. I was just telling the doggies good night, and I had Apollo and Eddie sitting on my bed with me, and I really lay down flat on my back. And in that moment, I felt the bed shaking forward, backwards for quite a long time. And I was like, what is this? Of course, my first thought it's an earthquake. So then I took my phone and I Googled earthquake, Vancouver, looked at all my seismic alert systems, nothing. So I was checking that for 5 to 10 minutes and nothing. So I'm like, okay, strange. I felt a little dizzy earlier. It was late at night. I felt like my head is exploding. So I really thought, did my blood pressure go up? Did I shake? Was that the case? Then I had another theory. Did Eddie scratch himself? Or sometimes when he really heavily licks his balls, guys, I have to tell it how it is, then he really goes like at it. But this bed that is here, that's a memory foam mattress. So that doesn't let the shaking travel. In other beds, it can really be uncomfortable when I want to sleep and Eddie is licking his balls. It's really shaky underneath my pillow. But that little dog could not have made that bed shaking like this. But I didn't find anything. So yeah, I was waiting a few more minutes and then I went to sleep because I was so tired. I was just making a video for you guys and editing and stuff like this, right? And then I woke up in the morning and I checked again, and then it was all over the news, another earthquake. And then I checked the time, 5 o'clock, 5 a.m., 5:02 a.m. And I'm like, that doesn't match the time when I felt it. And then I was thinking, when did I go to bed? When did I go to sleep? And I know that I walked the doggies, and I went to sleep right after I walked the doggies. And I remember that I went down in the hall of my building and looked at the clock, because I was wondering, there's some security guy sitting there at the desk, and I always like to walk the dogs if I'm in the morning late at night or like 3 a.m. or something, that he's there. And so I checked the clock because I know they're doing their runs at certain times. And I know that it was 3:39 a.m., something like this. It wasn't 4 yet, because I know he goes for a check at 4. So then the strange thing is, I didn't walk the dogs long, just go out for a pee, and then I went back up and basically right away went back to sleep. So the trembling that I felt, I would say that was at 4:15 latest. I did not go to sleep that late, like 5 o'clock. So I still don't know. I still have no explanation for this. But this earthquake, and you've seen my reports about the other ones where I was sitting right here and I said, I feel like, woo, it lifted me up in my office chair, the last one that we just had. And then last year we had one where I was on the couch and I felt like it's lifting me up on the couch. But this one, this was rattling my bed forward, backwards. So if you're lying there, you're going like, duk, 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 duk. And it was long. It was really strange. And when I look at the reports that I found from other people who felt it, they also said, wow, that was strong and that was intense and it was long. And we will talk about seismologists that are saying this was unusually long. This was kind of strange. The depth of the earthquake was approximately 10 to 12 kilometers. That is still considered shallow for an earthquake. And if they are very shallow, of course, they are more intensely felt, more noticeable on the surface. So this was a smaller, more localized event. If we would have the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, the big one with magnitude 9 or something, that would probably happen at a deeper depth of probably 30 to 100 kilometers deep. So what they're saying is many people woke up from it, and many reported a loud boom. I can't say that I witnessed this because the problem is I had earplugs in, because it's very loud here in Vancouver and downtown. So I had earplugs. I didn't hear anything. But they say it was a boom followed by a jolt, like a truck slamming into a building. I didn't hear that, but I've heard it a few years back when I was on the farm. But they're saying, you know, further away from the epicenter, it was felt a little less and it was a little bit more of a gentle sway. So where is this earthquake coming from, guys? So they're saying, you know, we know the whole Pacific Northwest, the coast of Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia sits under the North American plate, and that is moving about 3 to 4 centimeters per year. And of course, this subduction process is stressing the crust. And then earthquakes happen when stress gets released. What this quake was, it was likely a small slip on a small fault. But researchers have found out, for example, in California, we have that big San Andreas fault. And then we have many smaller faults going at a 90-degree angle sometimes towards that fault. So these little faults, if they have these earthquakes, they found out they could actually trigger the big one, the big fault. But of course, this one was not a major rupture, but we have to take it serious. And there's some reports. One guy says, I really felt that one. Hope everyone is feeling okay. Another guy says, this was the strongest one I felt in years and years. And the guy who says that, he's a seismologist. So he can evaluate that. And he said to the news today, this is a reminder that we need to be prepared. He's a local Vancouver seismologist, and he has given his opinion on this earthquake. That was, by the way, also felt in Washington State. It happened in Washington State, right? It was not only felt in Vancouver Island and Vancouver. Earthquake seismologist John Cassidy, he's with Natural Resources Canada in Victoria. He says that he felt the earthquake for as long as it lasted about 10 seconds. And he says that is pretty long. He says usually we maybe have half a dozen earthquakes that are being felt only around the southern part of Vancouver Island each year. And typically they are only 1 or 2 seconds of shaking, but this was 10 seconds. He made another post about it and he said, that was quite the shake here in Victoria. And the strange thing is, there have been many recently. This is the 4th earthquake that has been really felt by people, and I have felt 3 within the past month, and the 3rd in the last 10 days. So there was another 3.6 in Victoria on February 13th, another 2.5 in Victoria, and a 4.7 in Sechelt on February 21st. That was the one that I felt, where I was sitting on this chair that was lifting me up and down. And he says, we record tiny earthquakes every single day throughout this area. So it's not unusual to see earthquakes occurring around Vancouver Island, Victoria, Sechelt, and on the west coast of British Columbia. They're really happening all the time. That's what he's saying. And he says, but they're generally just a little bit smaller than those. He says, what is different this time is that we've had like 3, they're considered like felt earthquakes here on the South Vancouver Island and on the coast of British Columbia in a relatively short time window of about 10 days. And he says that thousands of people were feeling this earthquake this morning, and about 10,000 or even more felt the one in Sechelt on February 21st. And of course, that raises the question, is this increase of smaller events an indication that we could come towards the big one, the Cascadia earthquake, magnitude 9 or bigger? And he says, well, that's always the first question we get. Well, understandably, he says, well, it doesn't mean that we're closer and it doesn't mean that we're not closer. So it's 50-50. He says the amount of energy released in this little earthquake like today's, he says it's a drop in the bucket. That doesn't relieve stress so that we would not see the big one. But he says today's earthquake is a reminder that we live in an active earthquake zone, that we've seen much larger earthquakes in the past in this area, and that the importance of knowing what to do when that shaking begins and being prepared is very important, right? And I was researching what the city of Vancouver might have to say for this, and it scares me a little bit. I mean, if you see all these newer big towers, the companies that build them, they say, well, they're built to be survivable, not livable. What does that mean? I'm always wondering, the glass in these buildings goes until the floor. So the glass will fall out. And that's what they're warning. You know, you might survive the earthquake in the tower, but then you run out, you'll be hit by falling glass. But then they're saying, well, you have to be very careful because furniture will move around, because the big one that could last several minutes. But if furniture is moving around, it could fall out of the window, and so could I. You know, that's what I'm worried about. So is that really that survivable? I don't know. It's scary, but that's not what I found. I mean, that is still kind of a best case scenario if that tower still stands and only the glass falls out. But what I found is a little bit more concerning, I find, because CTV News Vancouver has just released an article about the bigger earthquake on February 21st. And they said this earthquake highlights Vancouver's vulnerability should the big one arrive. So they are also acknowledging that this serves as a reminder, a sharp reminder, that a large-scale seismic disaster still lurks, not only for Vancouver, right, for the West Coast, and that still needs to be done to adequately prepare Vancouver for this predicted catastrophic impact. And I've released a video about Victoria, the capital of British Columbia. How many buildings would actually collapse and how bad it is. So check that out, guys. So we know the big one, potential magnitude 9 or something, Cascadia Fault line running from Northern California to British Columbia. would also bring a succeeding tsunami that would devastate much of the Pacific Northwest. But there is another earthquake predicted that I would dare to say almost nobody here in Vancouver knows about. It's less infamous than the big one. And I'm still meeting many people that even don't know about the big one. So the other one is expected to be smaller in size, but way more shallow than the big one. Way closer to Vancouver than the big one. The Cascadia Fault basically is running west of Vancouver Island. And the other one will be way more damaging. That's what the experts are saying. Way more damaging than the big one. So that's what a UBC professor of structural engineering here is saying, Dr. Perry Adebar. That sounds absolutely scary, guys. And he says, well, people tend not to talk about that one. Yeah, because I think people do not know about that one. Everyone worries about the big one. So what he says is the chances of a large magnitude earthquake occurring off the West Coast is considered to be a 1 in a 400-year occurrence, while the really big one for here, the smaller, shallower, but more devastating quake, is considered to be a 1 in a 25,000-year chance. And the Geological Survey of Canada estimates a 1 in 5 chance of a damaging earthquake like this in the next 50 years. That sounds not so good. And he says the devastation of both, the 9 and that other one, devastation of either would be astronomical. According to the city of Vancouver, should a magnitude, let's say 7.2 earthquake hit the Strait of Georgia, 13,000 buildings would be at least moderately damaged. That is their estimate. I think we can, I'm always doubling this because I think that's what the reality is. 6,000 of those would likely collapse or require demolition. More than half of the city's residents would be displaced. Over 4,500 residents could face injuries, with over 1,300 people expected to be seriously injured or even unalived. You know, guys, why I have to say unalived. It's a YouTube thing. I'm not explaining it again. But what is the risk of structural damage? Let's look into this, and that is really scary. And there are maps of which buildings in Vancouver are at risk. So if you live in Vancouver, you can look this up. But are they really completely correct? I have my doubts because there's a lot of money involved with builders. You know what? Let me know in the comments. Should I try to interview some of these famous builders that build these towers and really ask them how safe are they? Because I always thought, you know, in Japan, like I think even in the 90s, they're building these big towers on some like mobile, like spring-like foundations so that they're swaying with the earthquake. But when I see the towers being built here, and I've seen many being built, and I had a bird's eye view on that, nope, they're not using that system. And I've talked to many builders that were actually involved in building towers. They told me, I can't verify that they're fast, built them cheap materials from China and cheap windows and make a lot of money. There are building codes, of course, but yeah, I can see it in this tower. It's crappy. Everything's breaking apart. So really the risk of structural damage in Vancouver is also high because the last time, and here it comes, and this is really what I find super concerning. The last time that Vancouver experienced an earthquake of such big scale, for example, as the predicted big one, was in the 1700s. And the largest earthquake felt in this century was Vancouver Island's magnitude 7.3 event in 1946. So really, Vancouver has not much experience with these earthquakes. That's why nobody probably knows. No, not nobody. Many people do not know about this, especially if there's new immigrants coming. So from a structural standpoint, what Adeba says is there have been no large-scale events to determine how Vancouver's current buildings would hold up in the midst of a quake. And when I read that sentence, how do you translate this, right? Well, we didn't have anything in the 7 ranges to see which buildings did collapse or to get rid of the old ones, to build new ones to replace them. So they don't know. Ugh. And then he says, given Vancouver's buildings and the topography they sit upon, they are different from others around the world. So there is limited precedent. So they don't know. So that's why they can't give a guarantee which tower will be survivable, livable, collapse. Well, there's certain buildings where we know, the older ones, the concrete towers, the brick buildings, yeah, they're at the highest risk. He said further, if you have an earthquake come along and knock down a few of the really bad buildings, we know which buildings we need to look for and we can do something. Scary, guys. He said we've had none of the benefits of previous earthquakes helping us to learn what we need to do. It's been quiet, and then all of a sudden one day it will be bam. It's going to hit. That's what he said. And he says then there's going to be really hard lessons learned. That sounds really scary, guys, from a perspective where I'm sitting right now. And overall, it is kind of strange, guys, I have to tell you this, and I'm thinking about this a lot since I'm reporting about all these earthquakes, these catastrophes worldwide, the volcanoes, and I'm sitting in an area that has both the Ring of Fire, all these volcanoes, and the worst earthquakes that can happen in this world, the potential, and it's overdue. The Cascadia Fault, and now the other one here in Vancouver. So I often think, should I move? And, I'm not living permanently downtown, but I have to be here enough so that I am thinking about this. Because I think it's going to be a total devastation, because with these earthquakes, it's not only the buildings collapsing and glass falling, and there's fires. They estimate if the Cascadia Fault hits, it could be weeks or a month until help arrives. Basically, he says, while the seismic upgrades that they've done so far are still yet to be put to their full test, pinpointing the buildings that are of a particular risk is a step in the right direction to ensuring Vancouver is sufficiently safeguarded. And he says, according to the city, according to the officials, neighborhoods expected to be hit the hardest is the west end of Vancouver. There's all these older buildings and towers and concrete buildings from the 1960s. The west end, downtown Vancouver, and the downtown east side, like Strathcona, Fairview, Mount Pleasant, and Maple. He says these pockets of the city have the highest concentrations of older brick, concrete, and older wood buildings. He says especially the mid-rise and high-rise apartment complexes. There's an apartment complex, for example, these beach towers, they're like waterfront, right? But they're old, they're concrete. And then there's a problem with the privately owned buildings. And he says the government is doing a great job trying to prepare for such a disaster, including the seismic upgrading of schools and public buildings. That's where they have a direct access to. But he says it means little in the light of the lack of efforts that are put into safeguarding privately owned buildings. And we've seen this in Victoria and Vancouver Island. Scientists are reporting that if there's real estate listings of private homes, the buyers don't care. They don't even ask if this home has been structurally upgraded, if the house has been secured on the foundations. They just don't care. Or they don't know. He says the privately owned buildings, those buildings, they're comprising much of the city's residential and commercial properties, are receiving no attention at all. And they would be hit the hardest if a large-scale earthquake were to hit. And he says, when we talk about the Vancouver skyline, there are privately owned buildings with what you might call ignorant owners. Well, ignorant, right? Money counts. And he says, these buildings are the ones that if we just spent a little bit right now, that we could reduce the risk enormously, then gosh, guys, do it, right? I think awareness needs to be spread way more. Because he says all it needs is a little intervention with these buildings, and they might actually be usable after the earthquake. Whereas if we do nothing and then the building collapses and ends all the occupants, what then? Because that's the alternative. That's what he is saying. He says there should be a system in place where buildings are rated on their risk factor. Apartment inspections, he says, would do well to include reports of the building's current seismic standing. Home inspectors should also do that, right? He said, it is sad that we're keeping everyone so ignorant. Yeah, that is true. Because I think there's not much public awareness of this. I don't even think that many residents or owners are really that ignorant. The big owners, yeah, they probably know. But the small ones that move here, that are lots of immigrants coming from other countries, I don't think they know. Nobody told me when I came here. I found out by myself, but I'm like a freak with earthquakes and volcanoes, right? The first time I looked out of the window and I saw this snow-covered mountain there, I'm like, what mountain is that? I'm like, oh, that's a volcano. Interesting. And then you do your research and then you learn about this. And then he further says that. He says, nobody has been asking for that information. Nobody's asking me. He says there are buildings that were built and met the building code at that time when they were built. But then after that, nobody asked any questions. No more upgrades to current codes or something. And he says these privately owned buildings are the focus of the city of Vancouver's risk reduction strategy that they are working on this year. But he says the work to do to reduce such risks is especially challenging. That's what the city said in a statement, probably to get through to these property owners and make them agree to spend money, especially if it's like larger landlords of rental buildings. There's considerations like affordability and tenant displacement, as well as regulatory and cost challenges. These are some of the many concerns that arise with privately owned properties. That's what the city is saying. Well, maybe they should give them some tax breaks or incentives or something to protect the lives of the inhabitants of these buildings. Vancouver's emergency management agency says, especially Miranda Miles, she works there. She says the city's preparedness for an earthquake is a continual process and not a box that can be checked and once completed. And that is true because they find out more and more and then codes are changing. And the same goes, she says, for the residents who may be feeling overwhelmed about their own levels of preparedness following the recent tremor. But as a resident, if your building's not safe, you can only prepare so much because you need to survive the earthquake. The building should not collapse, right? Then, of course, you should always have enough water, enough food, so that you, in my opinion, could last at least a month until help arrives. If the big one comes, the Pacific Northwest is like its doomsday scenario. That's probably going to be the biggest natural disaster that North America has seen in a long, long time. And she further says, we know this topic can be daunting and we really want to encourage people to take it just step by step based on where they're at. Preparedness doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be time consuming. It depends on what, if you have to prepare your house, you have to have the money and the means to do it, right? But to create the general awareness, she says, have conversations with your friends, with your family about the potential risks. That would be a huge step in the right direction to ensure that an emergency can be adapted to. Because if someone doesn't know about that this exists and then it hits, they're completely surprised. They don't know what to do. There are several small tasks like packing an emergency kit, practicing safety techniques, and securing the home to serve as manageable first steps. And when I came here talking to a person that I knew about that risk, and he said, yeah, I'm always prepared. And he had this, I thought this, it's just a file bag or something. Here, flashlight, water, first aid kit, this and that, walkie-talkie. So he was completely prepared. I was surprised that in this small bag, all the stuff that he pulled out there. And honestly, we should all, everyone that lives here should have something like this with them all the time, in the car, in the house. Because if you're in the car and it happens, what then? You need to have water, blankets, food, first aid kit, and dog food or cat food or whatever animals you have. The city is hosting regular sessions on the topic of preparedness. There's like BC Shakeout and stuff like this. But I still think people do not know that this exists too much. So I hope this was interesting for you guys from my perspective, because I'm right there. And you know, sometimes it's a weird feeling if you see that, if you report about a big earthquake in Japan or Indonesia or somewhere, and all the tsunami risks or the volcanoes. I'm not so scared of the volcanoes because you'll get the ash in Vancouver, but no lava flows or something. But the earthquake, if you see the devastation that is, if I'm reporting about this and bringing the pictures out to you, and I see these pictures, you know, can I describe it? I think we humans have the tendency always to subconsciously think, yeah, that's there. That's not me. But you have to make yourself aware this could happen to me while I'm speaking right now. But then still it's like, yeah, you just can't imagine, right? That your city, your place could look like a war zone, but it can. So I'm always saying, wherever you are, be prepared. Tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever, right? Be safe out there, guys. I'm thinking about you. And that was my update for today. Check out the videos in the end screen. If you liked what you saw, please leave it a like, and become a supporting member of the channel if you like. Look at the links in the description. This is how you can support me with my Buy Me a Coffee site. You can buy me a coffee or two to keep me going. Just check out the links in the description, and I see you in the next one, guys. Bye.